Annie Lay. A bright 24-year-old graduate student vanished without a trace 5 days before her wedding, and it wasn't because of cold feet. Surveillance cameras captured her entering a laboratory building on campus, but never documented Annie leaving. It was September at Yale University, the beginning of the fall semester when students still had time to enjoy the perks of homecoming, football games, and frat parties without schoolwork clogging their social calendars. Yet this normally festive time had a more solemn atmosphere in 2009, when Annie's disappearance launched an FBI investigation on campus.
Everybody in the state of Connecticut and all over the country were talking about it.
The FBI continues to head up the investigation, numbering some 100 law enforcement authorities from Yale, the city of New Haven, and the state of Connecticut in an all-out effort to find Annie Lee.
It's something that was really horrific.
It was a case that captured a nation's worst fears as the story of a runaway bride.
Let's turn our attention now to a story we've been talking about all afternoon, the missing Yale grad student, Annie Lee, who left behind her cell phone, her purse, her credit cards when she vanished from a campus lab on Tuesday. She was due to be married in New York tomorrow.
Turned into something much darker.
We had no idea what had happened, if she had left, if she had decided to just walk away, if somebody had taken her.
There were reports earlier today that a body had been found, reports that clothing had been found, reports that some of the ceiling tiles inside that building on the Yale campus were blown.
All while investigators pieced together evidence to answer the question on everyone's mind. Who would want to harm Annie Lay?
Sources say a suspect who is not a student at the university has been questioned and has failed a polygraph test.
And there are reports that the swipe cards put them both in that room,
Sure.
the last room where she was.
That's become a very crucial information.
The evidence at the end of the day is absolutely going to show that there was prior notice of this individual's violence and prior complaints, and that this incident with Annie Lay should have been prevented, could have been prevented, and Yale must step up.
Any idea why somebody would want to do this to her?
The only thing I can possibly think of right now, it's maybe a psychopath.
Born in 1985 to a loving Vietnamese-American family in San Jose, California, it seemed Annie Lay was one of those people who was destined for greatness. Compassionate, charming, and with an enviable wardrobe to boot, those who knew Annie could sense the under 5-foot dynamo's presence simply by the well-known clicks of her high heels.
Small, but spunky. Annie had herself together. She knew what she wanted.
And when it came to wants, Annie's sights were set high. On top of being named the valedictorian of her graduating class, Annie's academic endeavors were rewarded with $160,000 in scholarship offers that unlocked the doors to study cell developmental biology at the University of Rochester in upstate New York, making it no shocker that she was voted most likely to be the next Einstein by her high school classmates. In fact, after graduating from Rochester in 2007, Annie was on her way to becoming just that, as she was accepted into Yale's prestigious graduate program to pursue her doctorate in pharmacology.
Annie. Hi, Vanessa.
On top of her studies, which included a full course load, Annie worked at Yale's Animal Research Lab, where her experiments focused on an enzyme that could potentially treat diabetes, muscular dystrophy, and cancer. And it seemed Annie was deeply fulfilled by her work and studies. She was happy with her life, happy with herself, and happy with her dreams, Associate Professor of Pharmacology and Annie's boss, Anton M. Bennett, told the New York Times. That's why Annie was always smiling. But a career in pharmacology wasn't the only plan Annie had for her future. After all, she was an engaged woman. By 2008, the 24-year-old was engaged to her boyfriend from her undergrad days at Rochester, Jonathan Wadowski. And with Jonathan engaging in his own postgraduate studies at fellow Ivy League Columbia University in New York, the two found ways to make their long-distance relationship work, whether that was phone conversations that lasted hours during the week or weekends spent inseparably together. Their wedding was scheduled for September 13, 2009 in Huntington Village, Long Island, a dream come true for Annie who, according to her Facebook, didn't just see Jonathan as a fiancé, but her best friend. Yet, as the wedding day approached, the bride-to-be's excitement bordered on something else: fear. Were she and John too young to be getting married? This was the question Annie called to ask her friend Jennifer Simpson 6 days before she was set to say "I do." Jennifer reassured the bride that she should go ahead with the wedding. But when Annie didn't return to her residence the following evening on Tuesday, September 8, 2009, Was it possible the Yale campus had a runaway bride on its hands? It wasn't like the dependable 24-year-old to go radio silent on friends and avoid responsibilities, especially 5 days before her wedding.
People knew where she was. She talked to people a lot, used her cell phone to contact people. Her not communicating and vanishing was troubling to her roommate.
In fact, Annie's roommate was so concerned by this uncharacteristic behavior, she reported Annie missing to the Yale University Police Department that night. But while a student suddenly dropping off the grid might raise red flags now, these were different times, according to now retired New Haven Police Lieutenant Lisa Daddio.
At the time, nobody really thought it was anything significant at 10 o'clock at night. This happened in 2009. We're now in 2023. So, we're looking at it as how would we react now in 2023 versus how we would have reacted in 2009, and it's different.
Still, as a sort of welfare check, the university police paid a visit to Annie's last known whereabouts, her office at the Sterling Hall of Medicine. The pharmacology student wasn't there. According to her coworkers, she'd left work on an experiment at her lab a few blocks away at the School of Medicine's Animal Research Center building on 10 Amistad and never came back. Her phone, her purse, and other personal items, however, were still in the office. Had Annie been in such a hurry she'd forgotten the precious cargo? Or was this a hint that something more alarming had taken place? After all, it wasn't so long ago that Annie had written an article for Yale's medical magazine on campus safety.
She wrote, "New Haven is an area plagued with thefts and frightening confrontations," but adding, "with a little street smarts, you can avoid becoming a statistic."
So, was Annie's piece simply an attempt to draw attention to the local crime rate? Or was it possible the 24-year-old felt her life was in danger at Yale? Well, whatever the cause of Annie's disappearance was, on a campus full of security cameras and law enforcement, the 24-year-old had somehow managed to vanish without a trace.
You're in a secure building. Everybody knows everybody. What is the likelihood of something really tragic and horrific happening? And nobody hears it, nobody sees it, nobody knows about it happening.
Operating under the assumption they were dealing with a runaway, the Yale Police Department immediately enlisted the services of the FBI to help find Annie. And where better for law enforcement to focus their effort than the location where Annie's trail went cold, 10 Amistad. Once inside the basement of the laboratory building, the FBI and Yale police were met with the overwhelming stench of animal waste, the typical, if unpleasant, byproduct of the research being done at the location. With video cameras, they scanned through the seemingly never-ending halls, experiment setups, and rooms within until they came upon G13, Annie's lab. The room was searched for clues, however, nothing was found. Without leads, investigators turned to the public, informing the campus and media about the missing woman and offering a $10,000 reward for any tips leading to Annie's whereabouts.
Do you see her, hear anything? Please give us a call.
Okay.
And naturally, the news of a missing student caused a notable stir amongst the student body.
Parents are calling in, checking your state.
Well, I can't say that it's made me any more fearful, but I am aware that it has made others on campus fearful.
Any incident like this always brings up sort of the concerns about going to school in a university in a city. If it turns out this was foul play or something like that, I think that's really going to shake a lot of people up.
Still, the investigation continued under the impression that Annie had run away, despite friends and family that remained adamant she wasn't the type to flee. But if her loved ones were right, where was Annie? Law enforcement believed if there was one person who could answer that question, it was her fiancé, Jonathan Wadowski. See, while friends of Jonathan were certain he was devastated by the news of his missing bride-to-be,
he's an amazing kid, a wonderful, wonderful boy, and he just must be so heartbroken. I just cannot imagine.
When cases like these go sour, it's typically the significant other, isn't it?
You always look at the person that's closest to your victims as, being the one who has information or possibly, unfortunately, a suspect.
But when Jonathan arrived in New Haven to be interviewed by the FBI, it seemed he had an alibi. He had been in Long Island at the time of Annie's disappearance, a fact quickly verified by investigators. On top of this, a past polygraph test seemed to put Jonathan in the clear. But the case wasn't cold yet. See, due to the sensitive work conducted on the medical campus, Yale had roughly 70 security cameras that covered the outside of the research center, including the front and side entrances of the building. And it didn't take long for investigators to spot Annie in the footage, entering the building just past 10 a.m. in no clear sign of distress. Unfortunately, whatever might have happened once Annie was inside the building remained a mystery, as the basement level of the lab only had one security camera, focused on a corridor she never walked by. But just because investigators didn't have eyes inside the research center didn't mean Annie had gone unnoticed. Investigators focused their attention on the two other people who had access to G13, a contractor named Larry Godfrey and a lab technician named Raymond Clark III. When interviewed, Larry informed law enforcement that he hadn't seen Annie that day. Raymond, however, said he saw Annie in G13 when he entered the lab around 10:30 a.m. and again that afternoon when she was leaving the research center.
He said he'd seen her at approximately 12:45 that day. It was businesslike, it was friendly. He didn't say anything looked like it was wrong.
But it seemed the lab technician was mistaken, as analyzing the security footage frame by frame led investigators to one disturbing conclusion. Annie had never left 10 Amistad. She didn't appear on camera again after entering the research center, even when a fire drill at 12:50 p.m. should have forced her to leave her work. The implication? Well, it wasn't looking good for Annie. Still, law enforcement examined the footage for items people left the research center with that could theoretically be hiding Annie, alive or not. Unfortunately, no dice. It wasn't until Special Agent James Lawton had a eureka moment while watching his daughter perform handsprings on the kitchen floor that the investigation started focusing its efforts elsewhere.
I realized she was the exact size and weight of Annie Lay. I asked her to lay on the floor, I didn't tell her why. And I picked her up and put her over my shoulder and walked around with her.
At less than 5 feet tall and under 90 pounds, was it possible disposing of Annie was as easy as picking her up and putting her somewhere no one would look? After all, there was only one other way Annie could have left the building: through the trash. Investigators dug through animal carcasses and waste for signs of Annie, yet neither the trash nor the incinerator located over 40 miles away yielded any results. The pint-sized student had to be somewhere inside 10 Amistad, and law enforcement had one more trick up their sleeve to figure out Annie's last movements. See, to enter any room in the research center, employees had to use their key cards, meaning while there were no visuals of Annie in the basement of the building, there was data. And according to her keycard records, Annie last used her card to enter her lab, room G13, at 10:11 a.m., and never left. But did law enforcement find anything of interest in the lab? Initially, they hadn't. See, in the first days of Annie's disappearance, researchers and employees were still coming and going from 10 Amistad as the building was not sealed off. And on September 10th, a grad student named Rachel Roth discovered something of interest in G13 that she brought to law enforcement's attention: a red stained box of sanitary wipes. Then, an extra-large yellow lab coat with crimson stains was discovered hidden in a recycling box in the lab. By Friday, roughly 100 law enforcement officials descended upon the research center as Connecticut State and New Haven police departments joined the search of the research center's lower level, including previously unsearched storage room G22. Here, the team discovered something else of interest: a small metal bead, just like the ones Annie had worn on her necklace the day she'd gone missing. Had there been a struggle of some kind? Law enforcement continued to search the room, moving a cart placed against the wall to reveal another clue that something had gone terribly wrong: a splatter of red.
My heart sank. Something definitely happened to her.
And when luminol, a water-based solution used for detecting vital fluid, was later applied to the floors and walls of G22, the room lit up like a Christmas tree. But the biggest piece of evidence? Well, that was sitting right over law enforcement's head. While re-examining G13, Detective Ray Insalaco of the Connecticut State Police lifted a ceiling panel in Annie's lab and noticed something in the dark, narrow space: a rubber glove and a white ankle sock with a red stain.
We stopped everything and said, okay, we've got somebody that's hiding evidence big time on us.
With these discoveries, the building was locked down. 10 Amistad was officially labeled a crime scene.
New Haven State's attorney comes out to say, you know what? This isn't a missing person case. You have found now a couple of items that have blood on it. Let's start treating it as what it is, that there's foul play involved.
But the investigation into the disappearance of Annie Lay was still missing one key piece of evidence to prove foul play: a body. Still, there was something law enforcement couldn't ignore permeating through the lower level of 10 Amistad, a distinct scent the practice professionals knew all too well.
Human decomposition is very different than animal decomposition, and anybody who's done this type of work can tell you as soon as they smell it that there's a body somewhere.
But where was the scent coming from? The ventilation system in the research center meant it was impossible to trace the scent to the source, at least impossible for human noses. A cadaver dog was brought in, and the animal took investigators to a restroom across from G22. Detective Ray Insalaco searched the area, eventually trailing the scent to an area of the wall behind the toilet that held a metal access panel. It would be here that the search came to an end, as when the panel was pried open, the disturbing conclusion the investigation had been inching towards since Annie's phone and purse were found unattended in her office was finally revealed. There, hidden behind yellow insulation, the remains of Annie Lay were discovered at 5 p.m. on Sunday, September 13th, the day she was supposed to be married.
She hasn't been positively identified as of this time. However, we're assuming that it is her at this time, so we are treating it as a homicide.
Annie's body had been unceremoniously crammed upside down into a space no bigger than a few shoeboxes. There was trauma to her face and injuries to her body, meaning Annie was reportedly unrecognizable. Still, investigators could see the signs of an attempted SA, including undergarments displaced on her body, and it was determined her jaw and collarbone had been damaged while she was still alive. The cause of Annie's passing was ruled by the state medical examiner as traumatic asphyxiation by neck compression. Investigators noted her neck contained similar beads as the one found in G22. Annie also wore one sock and one glove, both matching the sock and glove found in the ceiling of G13. It was clear somebody had taken the time to hide these items, somebody who knew their way around the basement floor. And then in the wall, they discovered something else that would soon prove to be pivotal to the case: a green pen. In lieu of a wedding, Annie's family held a memorial service in California, while Jonathan, wearing the ring Annie was meant to place on his finger that day, held a service for his forever bride-to-be in the place where the wedding was set to take place, Huntington Village, Long Island. The night after Annie was found, a vigil was held on the Yale campus for over 1,000 students and professors, some who knew Annie and some who'd been forever robbed of that chance.
We're just, we're remembering like our happy times with Annie.
This is a horrific tragedy. This shouldn't happen in the world to anybody.
That this horrible tragedy happened at all is incomprehensible, but that it happened to her, I think, is infinitely more so.
It had taken detectives 5 days to find Annie, during most of which the research center had not been labeled as a crime scene.
We're all there and she's still in the basement, so that's messed up.
And as the campus began to grieve,
that's just, it's a very sad thing to have happen here at the university.
It's, just incredibly gruesome.
Those who knew Annie, like roommate Vanessa Flores, were faced with one nagging question: who was responsible for the crime?
The only thing I can possibly think of right now is maybe a psychopath, an antisocial person who, I don't know, maybe got upset about what she wrote about back in February.
But police were already narrowing in on one suspect.
The search for Annie Lay's killer is apparently focused on this man, 24-year-old Raymond Clark.
Sound familiar? The lab technician whose story had once seemed to check out was again a person of interest, and it was one fatal misstep that had tipped law enforcement off: Raymond's claim he'd seen Annie leaving the building.
She never left. So by his own statements, we knew he was lying.
Yet this wasn't the only hiccup from the lab technician's interview with police. Marks on Raymond's body and face were also noted by investigators, despite Raymond's claim they had come from a run-in with his cat. And like Annie's fiancé, Raymond agreed to a polygraph test, but unlike Jonathan, he flunked, a failure leading Raymond to lawyer up. There was also Raymond's suspicious behavior in the research center before the laboratory was sealed off, including meticulously cleaning and scrubbing G13 and attempting to conceal evidence graduate student Rachel Roth had discovered.
He tried to move the box where the wasn't in the line of sight, which according to the student and the officer was a little suspicious to them.
Still, this alone wasn't enough to find Raymond guilty of the crime. So, investigators went over the lab technician's key card records, and what they discovered was, well, incriminating. It turned out there'd been an unusual uptick in Raymond's key card use on the day Annie went missing, especially on two rooms, G13 and G22. which he was shown entering and exiting a total of 55 times.
He had key carded in and out, in and out, in and out multiple times that day and subsequent days until we locked down the building.
And then there was the sign-in sheet from September 8th, where RC were the only initials signed in a green inked pen, at least until 3:48 p.m., when his signature suddenly changed to black. Investigators also went back over the footage from the one security camera on the basement level of the research center that never captured Annie, but did, however, capture Raymond in blue scrubs and the same yellow-colored lab coat that had been found in the recycling bin. And footage from the exterior cameras was just as eye-opening. Raymond was caught leaving for his break around 10 a.m. in scrubs with a red drawstring. Yet in footage of him returning from the fire drill in the afternoon, he had clearly changed as his scrubs now had a blue drawstring. After the fire drill, security cameras also captured Raymond walking across the street to a park, where he sat down and put his face in his hand, a posture that could suggest exhaustion or guilt. The evidence against the lab technician was mounting, and it was time for law enforcement to act. At 10:30 p.m. on Tuesday, September 15th, Raymond was taken into custody on a warrant that allowed detectives to take DNA samples. And sure enough, Raymond's fingerprints tied him to numerous pieces of evidence.
The Hartford Courant is reporting an anonymous law enforcement official told them police have found DNA evidence implicating Raymond Clark III in that crime.
The official told the Hartford Courant that DNA was found in evidence in the ceiling and wall of the Yale laboratory where police discovered Lay's body.
Raymond's DNA was found on the green pen, the lab coat, and the sock. Additionally, Raymond's reproductive fluid was also found at the scene, suggesting attempted SA. As for the vital fluid found on the lab coat and sock, that belonged to Annie. On September 17th, 4 days after finding Annie's body, law enforcement gathered at a motel 30 miles from Yale in Cromwell and arrested Raymond Clark III.
Hey, big man. Joy jail.
The suspect potentially responsible for the horrific crime was now awaiting trial, cueing a campus-wide sigh of, in their own words, relief.
I think it's another step that's being made to close the case. I generally feel that the entire campus relief is going to be the general emotion.
I guess I'm more relieved that there is at least a suspect.
But what had compelled Raymond to take Annie's life?
Motive is the big mystery of Yale student Annie Lay.
The only person that really truly knows the motive in this crime is the suspect. What made him do what he did?
It's hard when you don't know the why and what was the trigger.
Since the suspect wasn't talking, the public developed their own theories. See, while Raymond had zero disciplinary action on his personnel record at Yale and no prior criminal history, some recalled encounters with the lab technician that showcased a more controlling and volatile side. According to those who worked in the lab, Raymond was a clean freak, and like other employees in the Animal Research Center, was known for reprimanding anyone who didn't maintain the lab to his standards.
If you weren't wearing shoe covers in the hallway, they would tell you to put on shoe covers or sometimes yell at the researchers.
And while sources told ABC News Annie had allegedly received messages from Raymond scolding her for leaving the mice cages dirty,
in those messages, he suggested the two of them meet. Authorities would not say if the communication went beyond that.
It seemed the news outlet had been misinformed.
We found nothing that was indicative of anything between the two of them. No text messages, no emails, no reports of anything, like nothing existed electronically between the two of them.
And this pokes holes in the theory pushed by certain members of the media and public that an affair had transpired between Annie and Raymond.
All of this evidence, all the theories seem to be moving toward a crime of passion. You say not so fast.
Well, look, she was engaged to someone else. I think it's disrespectful to her fiance and even to her family to suggest that there was any intimacy in this relationship.
Still, many wondered if the relationship between the two was non-existent, what had fueled Raymond's actions? Well, perhaps Raymond's crime came down to one overwhelming emotion: jealousy.
More homicides at the workplace, male on female, have to do with rejection than by far any other cause.
On September 8th, an email was sent out that announced Annie would be taking a couple of days off work for her wedding. Investigators theorized this was the final straw for Raymond. See, while Raymond was also engaged, it was law enforcement's belief that he'd been harboring feelings for Annie in secret. If this theory is correct, Raymond entered G13 at 11:04 a.m. to confront Annie, and during the 46 minutes the key card placed him in the room, things escalated.
Something definitely angers Ray, and he snaps, and Annie.
Then, in a panic, Raymond would have moved Annie to G22. Fingerprints on the stainless steel panels of the ceiling suggested he considered hiding her in the ceiling before realizing this wouldn't work. But before the lab technician could figure out where to put her, the fire alarm went off. He quickly changed his stained scrubs and left, as Annie's vital fluid continued to spread throughout the room. When Raymond returned, he moved Annie's body to the restroom, where she was ultimately disposed of sometime between the fire alarm and 3:48 p.m. It's a sequence of events that would require a level of anger that's hard to grasp, but not for Raymond's former high school girlfriend. According to Jessica Del Rocco, what started as a typical high school romance between herself and Raymond
is very popular. He was, a very nice guy. Everybody loved him.
Ended as anything but, as Raymond's control over what she could wear and who she could talk to escalated to aggression.
You say get physical.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't want to talk about that.
There are certain things the police
exactly
have requested you not to talk about.
Yeah.
According to a copy of a 2003 police report obtained by New Haven Independent, when Jessica tried to break things off, Raymond's behavior allegedly culminated in SA. His ex-girlfriend never pressed charges, but when it came to taking Annie's life, Raymond couldn't avoid consequences. While the lab technician initially pled not guilty to the crime, he eventually took a plea deal to avoid the possibility of receiving a heavier sentence at a trial. So on March 17, 2011, Raymond pleaded guilty for taking Annie Lay's life and attempted SA.
About 10 members of her family have traveled from Placerville, California. Her fiancé will also be here. They all want to be in the courtroom today to see justice done.
During his sentencing, Raymond cried as Annie's family delivered statements on the pain his actions had caused their family. "You took my only daughter, Annie. I will never hold my grandchildren," said Annie's mother, Vivian Lay. Reading his own statement, Raymond said he took full responsibility for his actions. "I alone am responsible for the passing of Annie Lay and causing tremendous pain to all who loved and cared about Annie. I am truly sorry I took Annie away from her friends, her family, and most of all, her fiancé," he said. "I really never wanted to harm anyone or cause emotional pain to anyone. All I wanted was to be a good son, a good brother, and a good fiancé. But again, I failed. I blame only myself, and there are no excuses for what I have done. Annie was and will always be a wonderful person, by far a better person than I will ever be in my life." But it wasn't an apology Annie's family was after.
While he certainly appeared remorseful, he didn't provide any answers. There were no answers given as to what caused him to do what he did.
The former lab technician was sentenced to 44 years for his crimes without the possibility of parole, meaning he won't be released until 2053. It was a victory for Annie's loved ones, although not one that can restore what was taken from them.
Nothing that happens here will ever bring Annie back to that family, but justice has been served.
And while the person responsible for Annie's death is behind bars, her case lives on. On the eve of what would have been her daughter's 2-year wedding anniversary, Annie's mother spoke to Dr. Drew about the wrongful death suit the family had filed against the institution they believed failed Annie, Yale.
Do you hope that this suit is going to protect other women?
Yes, speaking for my daughter Annie Lay, because I don't want nobody been like her, because she died in vain, she died for nothing.
The suit called for Yale to implement better security measures that would prevent what happened to Annie ever happening to another student again. After all, according to the Lay family's attorney, Raymond's personnel record wasn't so much spotless as it was scrubbed clean.
I can confirm that his supervisor at the lab where he worked and where Annie Lay was his brother-in-law, and also his sister was also a supervisor.
And while the suit was eventually settled by Yale for $3 million in 2016, in recent years, the senseless nature of the case has continued to attract attention, including that of counselor and YouTuber Dr. Grande. According to Dr. Grande, Raymond likely developed a one-sided attraction to Annie as she represented the status he was deprived of as a technician.
From his point of view, she was ideal. Within the laboratory, she was part of the upper class. Being with Annie would have increased Raymond's standing and minimized frustration about belonging to a lower class.
And this would mean the email about Annie's wedding wasn't received as a thoughtful heads-up, but a rejection of his alleged romantic feelings.
He became enraged and confronted her in room G13. He demanded to have sex with her, but she resisted.
So, in one irreversible moment, Raymond made the choice to take Annie's life. And in the end, that's what the story is about. Not what happened, not what's missing, but what was taken.
A brilliant, beautiful Yale graduate student and we can't take that away from Annie and her family, and at the time, her fiance, Jonathan Wadowski.
Annie Lay's life was taken during the day in a building surrounded by security cameras that only employees and researchers could access.
Ironic that she was so safety conscious, and this happened to her in a place where she was supposed to be safe, her own work, where you needed ID to get in.
And the most frustrating part, the motive of the person who took her life is still unknown.
It was a brutal, it was full of rage and anger, and we don't know why.
However, we do know one thing. Annie Lay was someone who wanted to change the world for the better.
All of her dreams and all the good she could have done were eliminated by one person.
But thanks to those she left behind, her wish to make a difference lives on.
I want Yale to change the security system and to be safer for the students.
Particularly the women students, right?
Yes.
This is the story of Annie Lay, the Yale graduate student and bride-to-be whose remains were found on what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life.